make a wish. One wish?
Steve McQueen, welcome to 7:30.
Thank you for having me.
Why did you choose to tell a story about the Blitz, and why through the gaze of a child?
It started a while back in 2003, the sort of initial want to tell a story about the Blitz when I was a war artist for Iraq. In the UK, we send artists off to war, and there I was on the ground. And at that moment, I thought to myself, it would be interesting to make a movie about what happened in 1940 during the Blitz in London. And then fast forward, I was doing some research on another project, and I saw this photograph of this child, this young black child, standing on a platform with an oversized winter's coat and a large suitcase and a cap. And I thought, what's his story? And the thing about children wanting to sort of focus on the children, how they view things, is, they're not tainted. They haven't got to a point where we adults are sort of, compromising or, refraining to look at something or pretending not to hear. It's for them, it's right and wrong. It's yes or no. It's good and bad. And at what point do we adults, start to compromise? And I thought to myself, well, him looking through his eyes, it will help us to refocus, help us look at things again and see a certain kind of truth.
And in looking for the truth of the Blitz, did you then go looking for other black stories, or were they already there everywhere? They just hadn't been featured in previous stories?
I wasn't necessarily interested in black stories, as you say. I mean, I was interested in the environment, again, through the research and through looking and working with the Imperial War Museum and working with a guy called Joshua Levine, who was my historian on this film. We found out that, London at that time, so particularly central London, was quite, as Joshua would say, quite cosmopolitan. And within that, there was a very large Chinese community. There was a black community. There was all kinds of different communities going on there, as well as, the predominant white community. But it was about, the landscape more than anything else.
What seems to be the problem here?
This gentleman has put up this sheet to contain us, to put us in a prison within a prison. I have no interest in looking at him, but I do not want to be concealed.
Sir, there is no segregation here. We are all equal members of this country, willing or not.
At the same time, we've been looking at these stories of the Blitz, of the war, for a long time, and I'm thinking about the history of British cinema. Is there going to have to be, should we see a reimagining of British history in cinema with more stories of the kinds of people who are in your film, in this film, Blitz?
Not necessarily. I mean, look, I'm just talking about an environment which was the environment. And as my son says, I'm not trying. He would say, I'm not trying to flex. I'm just trying to sort of portray the environment as it was. I mean, you go into the Café de Paris, a very hoity-toity sort of bar, which got bombed. And, the majority of the band, well, in fact, the whole band is black, and the band leader is a gay black guy, and there's Hungarians and Chinese and whatnot in the kitchen. I mean, that's just how it is. This is just research and putting it on the screen to tell a sort of true picture, to tell a story which has some depth and a certain sense of urgency because of course, what's happening in the world today.
Well, that's one of the reflexes, of course, watching the film. I'm thinking particularly of Saoirse Ronan's character walking through the bombed-out streets of East London. Unavoidably, you think of Gaza. Was that is that intentional in the edit of the film?
No, because we started to make this movie a long time before, before Gaza started. But again, it's indicative of the world where we're at, because there always seems to be a war going on. So I imagine this movie would be fairly urgent at any period of in time, really. And the unfortunate thing is, right now things are really heightened because, of course, it was happening in Sudan, what's happening in Ukraine, in Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, it feels. I mean, I just feel as an artist I'm useful right now. And again, to just jump on what you said about the traditional ways of telling a story. I mean, for example, women were the sort of physical and emotional sort of strength in the UK at that time during the Blitz, because most of the men were at war, and to basically present them in that way, because in the movies it never happens. But how does that not happen? Because somehow, some way, these guys were getting their missiles and their ammunition. It was through the women who were on the front line, in ammunition factories doing that. So that has to be portrayed too, because again, it's a vital part of what happened during the war.
And just finally, you are one of the great directors of music scenes, of parties and clubs. That scene in the dance club, is it minutely choreographed, or is there room for improvisation when you're directing those scenes?
Yeah, that was Coral, my choreographer. I mean, yeah, within that sort of range, there's obviously has got to be sense of spontaneity, but you're sort of, it's like even the dialect, or even how you move your body. This is how people would move at a certain point. But within that, there's a little sense of freedom, because that's what would happen often in those environments. But of course, there were two different clubs. There was the Cafe de Paris, which was much more formal, and of course the other club, which was a little bit more sort of looser. But that's again that's also to do with class and wealth and again poverty and everything else. So it's a very interesting look. This film, I hope people get the chance to see it. It just shows you rather the sort of landscape of what was going on during that time. And again, it was a real time of liberation, as well as war, because during, obviously, when you get to a point where people are sort of fearing for their lives, people take sort of risks because, they think it could be the end of days, as it were.
Steve McQueen, it's intense, it's very beautiful. I loved watching it, and I thank you very much indeed for talking to us this evening.
Thank you for having me.